This is Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University. I'm your host, Alan Mendenhall. I'm Associate Dean of the Sorrell College of Business and Executive Director of the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. My guest today is Greg van Kipnis, who is currently Chairman of the Board of the American Institute for Economic Research up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Greg, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we'll start with an easy question, which is to tell us a little bit about the American Institute for Economic Research and how you got involved with it.
AIER, I'll refer to it as, was started in the 30s by Colonel Harwood. He was an ex-West Point officer who was keenly interested in economics. Went and did when he exited from the service, he went and got his degree at MIT and was very much at odds with the then administration, Roosevelt, over economic policy, and founded his own institute. Initially it was in the Boston area, Cambridge area, and then it was moved out to Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Essentially, Colonel Harwood was a believer in free markets, minimum government intervention in the market, in the economy, which of course was going on to a high degree under the Roosevelt administration. He gained even greater fame later, which also led to raising a lot of money so that the Institute has a very large kind of an endowment. And that was, he was at odds with the termination of the gold standard under the Nixon administration. And particularly he was worried about the rising rate of inflation, the depreciation of the dollar, and advised Americans to protect themselves. And he created a vehicle for them to escape the ravages of inflation, which was gold-based. That led to people making a lot of money, and then ultimately he benefited from trust that the people that made all that money gave to the Institute to perpetuate its research future.
And my understanding is that you are instrumental in ensuring that the American Institute for Economic Research, or AIER, remained pure to its mission and stayed its course throughout the past, let's say, decade or so.
Well, that not all institutions have ever improving presence in the marketplace of economic research. After the colonel died, the Institute kind of lost its way. And when I stepped in, which is about 9 years ago, it had a lot of, well, weaker research-minded people, and they weren't having much of an impact. And we had to clean up, which literally led to about an 80% turnover of staff and to recruit new people, which today we have William Ruger as our new president.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about your story in general. And you're from New York. You were raised in New York, correct?
Born and raised.
Born and raised, and you eventually started your own hedge fund. You moved from London to New York and back and forth. So tell us a little bit about that story.
Well, if I may.
Sure.
You know, as a kid, you grow up in the city and you play in the streets, stickball, and you roller skate, and you have no idea what's in store for you in life. And I went initially to public school, and always wanted to have pocket money. And so I believe it, my first job ever, and I don't think I even was legally allowed to work. I set up a little shoe shine stand in front of the local tobacco store, and made quite a bit of pocket money that way. But of course, things got better. I went into an usher, as a local movie theater, and people tipped you to take them to their seat, which is a novel idea. You don't see that done today. But those were the early starts of ambition to, earn your allowance rather than depend on the contribution, the generosity of dad or mom. But I went through eventually a YMCA prep school, and got a scholarship to go to NYU, where I studied initially engineering and then discovered a field that words I didn't even know what they meant, called economics. And my first professor was a socialist, as it turned out, who taught the price theory course, and I just fell in love with the subject, dropped engineering and switched into economics, and then got my degree there. I also went through Air Force ROTC, got commissioned as an officer, but it was just after Korea had ended and they were delaying entry onto active duty, particularly because I wanted to be a pilot. They didn't want new pilots coming in too soon, so they put me in a control group. I go to graduate school. I'm almost ready to finish my dissertation when the Air Force activated me in 1968 and sent me to the Pentagon, which was a nice tour of duty for 3 years. But in between, while I was at graduate school, I got a job with IBM as an economist, and in their corporate headquarters, which was in a town north of New York City called Armonk, and learned a great deal about computer technology, how to code. In those days it was Fortran, how to run your own 1610, which was the computer that we had devoted for our department. So I got an education in economics, and I got hands-on experience with programming and running computers when there was a brand new idea, and that's long before there was such a thing as a PC.
And was the economic study part of your curriculum at NYU? You earned a bachelor's and a master's at NYU, if
Correct.
I'm not mistaken. Was the economics part of your curriculum, or are you more self-trained in economics?
No. There were two economics departments in those days. One was in the liberal arts school, and the other was in the business school. So you could major in finance or economics or accounting or management or marketing. I chose finance and economics.
And explain how, because you held several positions in finance, we'll say, and you made a transition to London at some point. Explain.
Oh, it's a long, circuitous path of
It
taking
is.
a lot of risk. But let me go back to the graduate school
Sure.
for a moment, because there were two professors who left an indelible mark that I didn't even understand had occurred. One was Ludwig von Mises, and the other was Israel Kirzner. One was a disciple of the other. They were both of the Austrian school, and I took their courses. I was very impressed. I made more sense to me because they focused on markets and how markets work. And while my skills were more in programming, mathematical economics, econometrics, they created a foundation or a basis by which I could understand there's something called Keynesian economics and there's something called free market economics, which the distinction was never very clear in those days. After I finished the 3 years in the Air Force, I came back to Wall Street, actually to IBM, and then by chance somebody recruited me to take a job interview at a small investment bank. In those days, it had 250 employees. It was called Donaldson, Lufkin, Jennerette. By the time I left that firm, there were 12,000 employees, and I went there as their economist, eventually as their chief economist and their research director. And in the very tail end of that career, which is spanning almost 12 years, something was innovated in Chicago called stock index futures, bond futures, and currency futures. And these are very mathematically based products. And I quickly studied that, wrote a few articles, and realized there were some interesting trading arbitrage opportunities between the way the futures contract was moving on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange versus how a basket of 500 stocks that constitute or define the S&P 500, and that you could buy one and sell the other if they were out of line with each other. Well, I write a paper, and the next thing I know, I get an opportunity to start a trading desk to implement the arbitrage. And I said, well, wait a minute, I'm a chief economist, I'm a research director, I'm a big shot. I get interviewed and quoted in the newspaper all the time. He says, I know, but this will pay you 3 times more. What do you think?
That's usually when you say yes. So tell me about the arbitrage. Is that something that is like a system, or is it something that could be packaged and marketed to other companies?
in its simplest sense, arbitrage has been around for hundreds of years. People would trade the difference in the price between gold is traded in New York versus the London markets. And literally, if they saw one was cheap relative to the other, and the transportation costs and the insurance costs and also were more than covered by the spread differential, they literally would buy where it was cheap, let's say it was London, and deliver it in the New York market. And so taking advantage of price differences of essentially the same thing has been around forever. It's true in the grain markets as well. It had never been possible to do that in the financial markets because there were no such things until roughly 1980, when these futures contracts were innovated in Chicago. So that let you trade bonds against bond futures and stock portfolios against stock futures. And it's one thing to understand the arithmetic. It's another thing, how do you implement the trade so that you can quickly buy one and sell short the other, and then hold them to some point where they converge and you could trade out of it and capture a profit. It wasn't easy because there was very poor technology in those days. But that's how it all began, and that ultimately led to running a proprietary trading desk. And I moved from Donaldson Lufkin to Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley wanted me to do this on a grander scale and sent me to London, where I had a desk in Tokyo, a desk in Paris, a desk in New York, and a desk in London, doing all kinds of things, other derivatives.
And this is prior to your establishment of a hedge fund, correct?
Correct. Somewhere in 1996, I got the bug to do it for myself, and found a backer, and one backer introduces you to another, and before you know it, you have a critical mass of money that you can justify hiring people and renting space and buying oodles of computers and high-speed links to exchanges. And I went into the business, and we started small, and that's what I did until 2005 or something like that, when I retired.
Well, we were talking before the show about the audience for the show and how most of the audience for the show are young people, students, college students, young professionals. And I'm wondering if you have advice for young people coming up today in the economy we have, who are looking for careers and just don't know what it is that they want to do. What advice would you have for them about exploring job opportunities or looking for what it is they want to do?
Well, I think the biggest inhibitor to people being entrepreneurs and innovators is the buzzword, oh, that's too risky. Risk is a funny word. And by the way, I'm told that in Chinese, the obverse of risk is opportunity. But in our world, risk usually means that there is an opportunity. You just have to understand what the risk is and what it isn't. But most people never tunnel and burrow into it. Yet over time, as I would meet more and more people in Wall Street, I discovered the minute they heard the word risk, they said, show me. So risk is invariably overstated, not even properly framed and structured as to what it is, what you mean by risk. And when you delve into the details, you discover that most of the risk is exaggerated. Some of it you can hedge away, or you can control, or you can shed in some way. And what the residual risk is tiny relative to the opportunity.
Well, and it's funny because I was just having a conversation with a student this week who was talking about what he perceived as a major risk, and it was just moving from one city to another city, which in the grand scheme of things seems, to people who have moved around quite a bit, a very, very minimal risk. But for the scope of his understanding, it was a very major risk. So I guess that is an interesting thing that everybody has to come to terms with, is taking chances. And you can be conservative, and there's a good way of playing it safe, but you also need to push your limits.
So only good things have come to me from the taking of risk, whether it was changing companies, changing careers, going from a chief economist to running a hedge fund, where if after a year you didn't make money, you lost your job. Even my wife was a risk taker from Mobile, Alabama, who I met in Wall Street, who dared leave the apron strings of home. And that's how we happened to meet in New York. And so she was a risk taker in her own way. And two risk takers met each other and lived happily thereafter.
I assume you took I-65 up here today, so you took risks just getting here from Mobile. Is that where you came from this morning? Did you come from Mobile?
Yes, we
Yeah.
drove up.
That's great. Well, I want to know a little bit more about this changing careers. When you spoke of going from one area to another, and you talked about how that was in some ways motivating because you had pressure put on you. And there is something about pressure that can be motivating. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was this weekend, about how we look at anxiety wrong, and we consider anxiety to be purely negative, but that anxiety is actually an evolutionary signal that you need to be moving faster, that there's something that there's a problem that needs to be addressed, or there's a struggle that you're having that you need to overcome, but you need not to be lazy, but to get up and do something about it. That anxiety can be a motivator.
Sure. I would be honest if I said that I never felt anxiety. I felt tremendous amount of anxiety. I tell you that the idea of just picking up and leaving two daughters in New York to fend for one in college, while I go to London to create a career there and deal with, where they treated me, they called me a Yankee or a colonist, depending whether they liked me or not. There's a lot of risk. But that's, those are good challenges, but you gotta, all right, I'll give you one story. So I'm at IBM. IBM was then considered the safest company in the world. It had a lifetime employment policy towards employees. Join Mama, Blue, and you'll be there forever. And there I am after 7 years, getting a job offer at this small, relatively obscure firm called Donaldson, Lufkin, Jennerat. The administrative assistant to the president then called me in and said, "What are you doing? Why are you leaving IBM?" I said, "Because somebody else thinks I can add more value somewhere else, and they're offering me quite a challenge. Why wouldn't I do that?" They thought I was insane, and in the end, it's kind of funny. I'm not saying I predicted the demise of IBM, but IBM was not going to last forever because they didn't compete properly with the new arrival of the PC. They thought, oh, PC's not important, always be the world of big mainframes. Well, they made their calculated mistake. But it turned out a great choice. Left them and took chance.
Well, those days of staying at a company for 30 years and getting the company watch are, they're kind of on the wane, I would think.
Your loyalty has to first be to yourself. You have within you a potential to realize. I mean, that's why your parents brought you up. That's why they taught you morals and ethics. That's why they try to make sure you got a good education. Now it's up to you to do something with that. And some companies will move you along and give you ever-increasing opportunity. Others don't. The companies weren't created to maximize my value to myself. They're there to create maximum value for themselves, and I just may be not the perfect fit for that.
Well, you know what I love? I love that when you started getting interested in economics as a college student, you would have no idea that here you would be now, still writing articles and providing commentary about economics.
Economics is such a vitally important subject. It explains why things occur. You know, nobody engages in any activity, any kind of an exchange, unless they feel that they're getting something for it that is in excess of what they have to put into it. And once you understand that sort of hedonic calculus that goes on in your head, goes on in the head of everybody, it becomes the basis by which you can more rationally make any and all decisions in your life, whether you function as an economist or not. But you're right that no matter how far I drifted into the money-making world of running a hedge fund and trading, still the spectacles of looking at things from the eyes of an economist never left me. So as soon as I retired and got onto this board, then became chairman of the board, I started writing research articles again, which I hadn't done for a long time.
Well, I want to go back to something you said earlier about taking classes with Kerzner and Mises. What was that like?
I had no idea what I was being exposed to at the time. Neither name resonated as representing something important. It's only years later, as you mature, you begin to engage with the world, you begin to see government policies, you begin to see why people succeed and fail for their independent initiatives as opposed to the government plans and economy. You begin to realize the importance that these men, I mean, we call it the Austrian school, and it's true because that was where they were in Vienna, where Ludwig Mises was the professor. But they're really practitioners of what was called free markets. And that was an outgrowth of Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the real father of what we used to call liberal economics and free markets.
Did you see my tie? I've got
Yeah,
Adam Smith
yes.
on my tie right here. And I've got an AIER lapel pin too,
Yes, you
by
do.
the way. So
Yeah, thank you.
I'm dressed appropriately for this interview, but sorry for interrupting.
Well, I should have worn mine, right?
Yeah.
So no, I didn't realize the gift that I'd gotten, but later, you know, I could boast. I actually studied under von Mises, and people thought that was rather amazing.
It is rather amazing. What was he like as a professor? I think I recall that he was an unpaid lecturer at NYU. All those lectures he gave and all the teaching he did in NYU, he was either unpaid or he was paid by private money, if I recall correctly. I might be mistaken about that.
That could be. I'm not sure. That I didn't know. As a coincidence had it, though, I got to know him a little more socially than sort of socially. It turns out he lived in the same neighborhood that I did, and we would often meet on the subway. People traveled by subway freely and happily in those days. And we'd get to chat. And he was curious what I was doing. I didn't understand why he was interested in me. He would encourage me. But as I said, Keynesian economics is what is emphasized in school today. And the mindset of that is, what should government policy be to improve the economy, improve growth? It isn't just, well, what do we do if there's a recession and there's a problem that should the government intervene in some way? But there's always the orientation of how the government should insert itself into the functioning of the economy, when in fact, if you really study Adam Smith and von Mises and Hayek, they say that no, people are self-adjusting to any and all circumstances. If times are tough, people tighten their belt, they make automatic adjustments, people change their products, they change their careers, and in the end, they are the ones who are creative and productive in a competitive free market and produce growth, not government.
Right. Those who produce value to society ought to be rewarded for the value that they give us. I think you would be very pleased with our economics program at Troy University. We have a master's in economics program, and Austrian economics and public choice economics are both features of the curriculum. It's a very free market oriented program. Of course, our mutual friend and colleague Stephen Miller
Right.
is a professor there, so I think you would be quite
Well,
pleased with
public
what we're
choice
doing.
is interesting new area because that was not part, to my recollection of reading, part of the Austrian school thinking. I think that's an innovation of American scholars.
Yeah, I think particular James Buchanan
Buchanan.
was fundamental in instituting the discipline of public choice. Yeah.
And so, in that sense, the American educational system has actually evolved free market to find out rational ways for governments to implement its policies, as opposed to just intervening and priming a pump and spending money.
Well, what's on schedule for the rest of the day here in Montgomery? I think you're going to do a little sightseeing, see a few friends.
Yes, we are. I've never been to Montgomery before, and I know it's a city with great history and interesting museums, so I plan to take them all in.
It is. Well, it's very nice to have you here. Very pleased to have you on this program, and I'm glad that your travels here were safe. So thank you very much, Greg, for joining me.
Remember, risk never rests, nor should you.
Risks never rest, nor should you. You heard it first here from Greg van Kipnis. Greg, thank you for being here. This has been Success Stories, a program of the Sorrell College of Business.